Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm talking to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we have a very special show because we have a conversation with an author who is all the way in the great state of Texas. She just published a new book called The Lost Boy's Gift, and she's an award-winning author of such novels as Blooming at the Texas Sunrise Motel, Dear Hank Williams, which is the first book I ever read by her, The Water Seeker, My Louisiana Sky, and also When Zachary Beaver Came to Town, the winner of the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. And she is also, of course, the author of the extremely popular Piper Reed chapter book series, which our local library, I think, all of them are right there on the shelves. So that's another interesting series of books that came out of the pen of this author that is going to be our guest today on The Written Page. And I'm talking about Kimberly Willis Holt. Kimberly, thank you so much for answering our call, and welcome to The Written Page.
Well, thank you, Anton. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Now, you were born in Pensacola, Florida, and part of your family hails from central Louisiana, where Dear Hank Williams was set. You live in Texas now with your husband. Did you live in Florida long as a child, or did you move around?
I moved around. My dad was in the Navy, and so I was born in Pensacola, Florida, but we left there when I was 2 and moved to Paris, France. I went to kindergarten there, and then we moved to Norfolk, Virginia, Alexandria, Louisiana, Barragata, Guam, Bremerton, Washington, Forest Hill, Louisiana, where this book is set with it under a different name, and then New Orleans, Louisiana. So that was all by the time I was 14 years old.
Wow, you certainly have lived all over the world, as the information on one of your books says. And I wonder how these experiences of traveling so much and moving around so much influence your writing or your view of the world.
It influenced it greatly. I always felt like a Southerner, not just because I was born in the South, but because of my family's roots in Louisiana. Many generations on both sides of my family have Southern roots in Louisiana, in the central Louisiana area. And my parents always made that life real to me. So they would tell me stories of their childhood. And so I, think that has had such a big effect on my work. And at the same time, I have sort of a worldview of that because of traveling, and maybe even an appreciation that sometimes local people, although I have to say people in Forest Hill seem to know that they got something good there. But I really think that, the Southern roots, but also having the fact that we move different places, and I've always had to learn to navigate in different ways, and I met all kinds of people and had many settings, that contributes too. Setting is really important in my story, and I think it's because my setting changed all the time.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. Now, I was very lucky as a child because my father is a big collector of books and records, and so any book that I wanted, I could just find on his shelves. And the house was full of books growing up, and I'm wondering, what books and authors do you remember reading as a kid? Any that maybe have left an important mark on you as a writer? What are your first memories of reading and of literature?
Well, my parents were both readers, although it's kind of an interesting story because my mother ended up being a teacher, but my mother said my dad was really more the reader when they got married. And so he loved reading, and she one time picked up a book that he had called The Yearling. And she read that book, and after that, she became a lifelong reader and a teacher, and knows how reading, valued reading. And we were always growing up around books. When at school, we had the library, of course, but we also, because we were military kids, we'd go to the military-based library. So I would have a summer. I remember the Nancy Drew summer, where every week I'd go get 2 or 3 Nancy Drews, and then we'd go back the next week and I'd get 2 or 3 more. But I also read the Little House on the Prairie books, all the Laurel Ingalls Wilder's books, all the way from the Big House and the Little House in the Big Woods, all the way to these last golden years, or the 4, I can't remember now, the last one in the series, but all of those, and I read those many times. Also read Little Women a lot. That book I have probably read more than any other book. So those books were before 10 years old. Those had a lot of effect on my reading life.
Is there any author or any book in particular that you would think has had an important influence on your style of writing or in the way you view your literature?
I don't know if it's my style of writing, but definitely the view of literature. When I was in 7th grade, I picked up in my junior high library Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a children's book, but there was a young person in it that I identified with named Nick, and I think she was 12 or 13 in that book, and that's how old I was when I found it, 12. She was lonely. I was lonely. I remember my life was, go to school, and I had a few friends, but I really didn't socialize much. And so when I went home, the Watergate trials were going on, and I remember watching the Watergate trials. That was something that I remember, feeling the way Nick did. I wanted to have people to like me. I wanted to be popular. So, but more than anything, that book showed me that you could write to make where the characters seem real. It's not that the other books I've mentioned earlier, the characters didn't seem real, but those people in that book reminded me of people that my parents talked about growing up in their rural town in Louisiana. And I think that had a lot to do with what I chose to read after that, mm-hmm. but also my writing today. I want people to think the characters are real, that they seem like people that can, that you could know. One time years ago, I remember one of the nicest compliments I ever got, and this was before I was published. I was taking an intense writing workshop at the local university, and a lady in that class said later about one of my short stories, she said, "You know what? I found myself wondering what happened to those people." Then I had to remind myself they weren't real. That meant the world to me.
Mm-hmm. I totally understand that. My wife always says that it's difficult for her to get into a novel or into a movie that has no women in it or almost no women in it. And mm-hmm. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, do you think it is important as a reader for you to in some way identify with some of the characters or some of the elements in the story in order to enjoy a book, or is that secondary?
I will answer that differently than I would have maybe 5 to 10 years ago. I think that for me to get in a book, I have to be fascinated by the character. I have to be interested in the character. That may mean that I relate to that character like I did with Nick in the book, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Mm-hmm. Or it may mean this person is nothing like me, and I want to know why they're doing this and that. They're so, different and interesting. I don't think you always have to relate to the character. I think they have to interest you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, I've always known since I was a little kid that I want to be a teacher or a professor, and I actually am a college professor now. I'm wondering if there was a moment when you decided to become a writer, or if this was something gradual, or if there was a moment when you realized this is what I want to do. When and how did you decide to become a writer?
When I was in 7th grade and read the Carson McCullers book, that was life-changing with my writing. But before that, I loved writing. I remember in 2nd grade, a teacher reading a book or a story that I wrote about some bunny rabbits that probably was very much like Peter Cottontail, but she made me feel good. That's the first time I remember feeling good about writing, putting words on a page. But in 4th or 5th grade, I started thinking about it, but it became a secret dream. And because I wasn't a great student, I struggled in school. I read slowly. I still read slowly. I have to read at the speed that someone's speaking to comprehend. And I've tried to read faster, and I can't. I think part of it is I do verbalize when I'm reading. I didn't realize that until I was in college, and I read a book on speed reading, and that was one of the things that they said is difficult, to read fast. Mm-hmm. But anyway, in fifth grade, I didn't think I was a great student, and so I thought, well, I never can be a writer, but that sure would be my dream. In seventh grade, I wrote a poem about a Vietnam soldier. It was during the Vietnam War, and I showed it to my friend in science class. Her name's Trina, still friends with her, and she showed it to the science teacher because she liked it. And the science teacher liked it, and he made me go show it to the creative writing teacher, and he liked it. And, he said, I hope you'll be in my class next year. And, boy, you better believe I was, because I went to school that day thinking I really could never be a writer, but I went home that day thinking I am a writer. And so those teachers had a big influence on me, but also my friend did too, because it really started with her.
You have concentrated on writing works for young adults, with nowadays we know as young adults literature or young adults fiction, and some of them have been really popular, and the ones that I have read have really impressed me for the stories, the characters, the way, also the very direct way in which they are written. And I wonder, as you develop a story for kids, what elements are important for you to convey in that story, if anything in particular?
When I sit down to write a story, I really just have a story to tell. It doesn't have a message, not intentionally. Mm-hmm. But I've been writing a long time now, and I think I do have a message, and I think it is acceptance. And I think it goes back to the fact when I was a new kid, moving, and even as an adult moving, we all want to, and really everyone does, everybody wants to be accepted. But a military kid or another child that's moving a lot and their environment's changing, they really are doing it a lot. And so acceptance becomes a bigger thing to them. It's not like growing up in one place where your next door neighbor's your best friend, or the guy around the corner is your best friend, or whatever. And you've got a friend for life. It's reinventing yourself every time and putting yourself out there again every time you move.
I see that idea of acceptance for sure all over Dear Hank Williams, coming in and out of the book, woven in the different aspects of the book, and of course very clearly as well in your latest novel, The Lost Boy's Gift. As you write for kids, for young adults, what is the most challenging aspect of writing for that kind of audience?
It's more challenging for me now in what I'm about to say than it was when I first started, is staying always in a child's voice. Maybe not the voice, but what they would say. Mm-hmm. I would say when I started writing, I don't think I was very grown up, even though when I say I started writing for kids, I think I was in I was 33. I think I've matured a lot. And so I have to remember, that I'm not always, you have to always remind yourself this is from a 9-year-old's perspective, or this is from a 13-year-old's perspective. And I've read books. A lot of times adult authors are very guilty of this when they do it from children. Mm-hmm. They try to do a children's point of view, or a child's point of view. And it's too adult. And, I see it a lot that, they don't get called out on it, I guess, because it's adult literature. But I have to be careful of that now. Not that I do it a lot, but, thank goodness I have a wonderful editor, and she'll say, this sounds too grown up. And so I didn't have that as much early on, and all I can think of is maybe I've emotionally grown up more in the last 20-something years.
So it has to do more with yourself than maybe with a development in society, would you say?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Would that have to do more with yourself, with your way of writing, or would it have to do more with maybe the society is different now than when you began writing?
Oh, I see what you're saying, because no, I think it has to do with me. I really do. And the other thing is that I have the benefit of having a child, a young
Mm-hmm.
child, when I started writing. My daughter was 6 years old, or 7 years old. She was into first grade, and you know, I was around children more than I am now. I don't have grandchildren, but I'm not. I go to schools and visit schools, and that's very helpful. But it's not like living with a child every day.
No,
So I think that has something to do with it. And so I am a little bit out of touch with what children today, as far as technology, as far as maybe what they do. But that can be learned. What I am still, I think, able to do is, because it hasn't changed, and that is the emotional life of a child or a person. We all go through the same things. A child just does it, from their perspective. But children still get their feelings hurt. Children experience joy when they do something. They know what it's like to feel proud. They know what it's like to feel like a failure. None of that's changed. That's universal.
when you approach writing a book like Dear Hank Williams or The Lost Boy's Gift, do you write a detailed outline, chapter by chapter, or do you like to improvise a little more, or maybe a mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of both, but I don't outline. I use what Aristotle's incline, which I learned from a book called The Weekend Novelist. I'm a big fan of his third edition. He ended up changing it dramatically with a co-writer, and that one has not spoke to me. It may speak to somebody else, but it doesn't speak to me. I've looked at both of them, and maybe it's just because I was so used to the third edition of that book, or third printing, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But so first, I guess the first edition of the book, and I have the third printing. But it is a book that really helps you write a novel. And I didn't use it from the very beginning, but when I went to rewrite my first book for my editor, I had since bought it. And so the way I do it is that I write my key scenes first,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't do them in the order that you would think. I start with the opening scene, and then I go to the wrap-up scene. Then I go to the midpoint of the novel. Then I go to the first plot point 1, which is between the opening and the midpoint. Then plot point 2. And I should back up. After the wrap-up, I do the catharsis. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the third one. That's kind of confusing, but if you had the Aristotle's incline in front of you and his book, you would understand what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it works for me because even when I didn't use that, when I start a story, I usually know the ending.
Mm-hmm.
I know the beginning and the ending. And maybe that's why this method works best for me. So I will write, even though they're very sketchy, they're not full and lush. That's not the way my early drafts are anyway. I will do the key scenes first, and it really helps me. It anchors me. Or I have an anchor, or a North Star, so to speak, when I'm, knowing where I'm going. And then I write a first draft, and I write it, in an organic way. But I have those key scenes there. And I even rewrite the key scenes without looking at them. So when I'm writing the first draft, I will just write all the way to the end and not look at the key scenes. I'll go back if there was something in the key scenes that I might want to include. But I already know them, because I wrote them earlier. So I hope that didn't sound confusing.
No, I completely understand. It's an interesting way because it implies that you have an overarching idea of what it is that you want to tell, and you know where you want to start, and you know where you want to end, and then you keep working in the middle of it, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. And thank you for being able to articulate that better than me. I was talking to some high school kids earlier this year, and a young man kept saying, "Now, since you outline," because I told him, I said, "I don't outline. I really don't outline." because I tried that with my first book, and I went way on the wrong path.
Mm-hmm.
I think it takes some joy out for if I did it that way. But what I do really, it's actually kind of fun, and it makes you feel safe when you're writing that first draft. It doesn't mean that they don't change. Those key scenes could change dramatically. Many times I could go, oh my goodness, that's not even the key scene. I shouldn't even have that in the story, or that's not the midpoint of the book. That's that should come up earlier. So that's just, but it's just the way. I mean, a lot of people have their own way, and that's just my way of getting to the true story.
You're listening to the voice of Kimberly Willis Holt, coming all the way from Texas, and she is an award-winning author of books such as Dear Hank Williams, and her latest one, The Lost Boy's Gift, which was published just a few weeks ago. Really, it's hot off the presses, published by Henry Holt and Company out of New York City. Let's talk a little bit about that book, Kimberly, if we must, really, because it's really the book that just came out, the one I just read, and I liked it so much that I thought I really need to get in touch with Kimberly so we can chat about this book. Now, The Lost Boy's Gift, that came out just a few weeks ago, is a very poetic, really thoughtful novel. I really like the fact that the narrator is so sympathetic to all the characters in the story, and there are several really interesting characters in the story. But before talking about these characters, I would like to know how this novel came about. How did you have, or in what moment did you come up with the idea to write this book?
Well, first of all, it's kind of an interesting story because it's also a story of how an editor works with a writer. I've been very fortunate to have my editor, Christy Ottaviano, for the last 23 years that I've worked with her. And she, I've been writing. What happened? Let me start with this story. It was raining and raining and raining a few years ago, about 3 years ago, in our city. And I opened the door to let my dog out, and a little spider marched in, or scampered in. Like he was saying, let me get out of here. It's, it's raining out there. And I thought it was so funny. And so I kept thinking about it, and I wonder what he wants besides being dry. And the next morning I realized he wanted a cup of tea. And I sat down, and I just started writing this, what I call a little ditty, about this spider that shows up at a middle-aged lady's house, and she's able to talk to him, and talk with him, and he talks to her, and he wants some tea, and so I just amused myself with it. I was actually finishing up on the first book in a 2-book contract, very last stages of it, galley stages. So every once in a while, I would write a little ditty about Tilda Butter, this lady. And all of a sudden I realized, one day I realized the mailman was in love with her. Do we wonder? And I did little stories about that too. And I would just write these little ditties. And I knew it wasn't a children's book, but I thought it's kind of childlike in its same way. And Daniel showed up in one of the stories. But, I didn't think he was going to be really special to the book. So my editor, when the galleys were finished, she thought that I was probably working on the second book, and she asked me where I was with it, the second book in the contract, and I said, I haven't started it yet. And she said, oh. And I said, well, let me tell you what I've been doing. I've been working on these little vignettes, and I said, I have no idea where they're going. I just wanted to have fun with it. It's nothing you'd be interested in. She goes, well, tell me about it. And I told her pretty much what I just said to you. She said, can you send them to me? And I sent them to her. They were these, no connection, just these little slice of life vignettes. And she called me and said, Kimberly, this can be your next book. And I said, really? And so, because Tilda was this, fun character, but she said, tell me about the boy. And I said, oh, he'll be in a few stories. He's a next door neighbor, so she'll see him. But it's really about Tilda. And she said, really? You might want to think about that. Now, he and his mother moved to the neighborhood because she just got a divorce. And I said, yeah, but I'm not going to mention that. They're just, they're, just a family, because families come in different ways, and they're a family. And she said, you might want to think about that. Divorce affects a lot of children. I was just reading about that. She said, it's how many. It was amazing. And she said, you might, so she didn't say this needs to be about Daniel. This needs to be about a boy whose parents have just gotten divorced, and he's having to, make his way, navigate his way in a new area. And he's very upset with his mother. She didn't say any of that. But I thought about it, and I realized she was right, that the story belonged to Daniel, and that the divorce was going to be a big part of the story. Not the happening of a divorce, but a child having to adjust to his parents being divorced and having to live just with one of the parents. But Tilda's role was going to be important too. She was a support role, though. And when things really started to click for me with that story, is when I alternated the voices, but I realized I needed to know why Tilda was there. And when I did that and I explored Tilda's childhood, to me everything fell into place. Because in many ways, even, their lives were parallel, just at different times.
Mm-hmm. I love the way that you interweave the present and the past, the different voices, and the fact that the narrator is there to kind of anchor all of those voices throughout the book. And I think it's really interesting that you talk about the fact that originally you had those vignettes, because if you think about it, a lot of the chapters are really short. And that must have come in some form or fashion from that fact that you began with some slices of life, sort of vignettes like that, and then after a while, this turned into, as you said, your next novel or the next book in that contract. But one thing that I noticed in this book that was quite fascinating to me was the way in which so subtly you mix realism and fantasy with this woman that. The novel is quite realistic in many ways, because you're exploring this kid's difficulties in dealing with the divorce of his parents, which is a very real thing, a very material thing in many ways. But then there's this lady who can talk to animals. There's a saxophone that falls from the sky. How did that come about? That's very interesting. I really like that mixture of fantasy and reality that you are putting into this book.
Well, I love mystical realism, and I've done it before in another book, The Water Seeker, but it's fun for me because I still love realism, but I think, life does have miraculous things can happen in real life, too, and so maybe that has something to do with it. Mm-hmm. But I knew that she was going to talk to the animals early on, so that made it, of course, somewhat a fantasy. But the divorce sort of grounded it, because then it became a serious thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what happened. And then I just sort of explored. I had fun. I didn't want the animal part just to be the only part that would be mystical or magical. Mm-hmm. And so, that was why I had the saxophone, fall out of the sky when this one, lady that everybody thinks is just a strict piano player, she has a dream too. She has a gift that falls at her feet, and yet she's afraid, to do it. I just had fun with it. The fireflies, and I'm a gardener, mm-hmm. and as a kid I loved being outside. My husband asked my, dad. He goes, Ray, when Kimberly was little, did she play in the mud? And he said, yeah, she did. She liked to play in the mud, and I love, when I find a frog or a toad, I get so excited, that if I'm out a little bit later and one's on my porch, that just is so exciting to me. I think nature, is miraculous. And so to be able to apply that in the book was fun.
Now, the character of Tilda Butter.
I talk to the creatures too, but they don't talk back.
Well, the character of Tilda Butter that you mentioned before, that you thought originally that the book could be about, she really is an important character in the book, as you say, and in my opinion, one of the most interesting ones, one of the most unique in the book. Now, she has a dog, she has a pet snail. I'm sure you've been asked this before. Is there anything of yourself in Tilda?
Yes.
don't want to get too personal here, but I wonder that reading the back of the book.
My friends who I do a writing retreat with every year, when I took the early bits to them, they laughed and they said, "This is so autobiographical," and they said, "Now, is Dewey Wonder your mail, or do you have an interesting mailman that you have a crush on, or he has a crush on?" And I said, "No, Dewey is Jerry, my husband." And but I didn't realize how much Jerry was like Dewey. But this was so funny. He doesn't hopscotch. But at that same retreat, we found some hula hoops in the house we were renting, and we had like this. Here we were, middle-aged women doing this hula hoop, trying to hula hoop, in the late at night. And we said we're going to have to. We'll do wherever we go. We're going to have to do a hula hoop competition. And I told my husband, I said, I don't know how to hula hoop very well. And he went, "Oh, I can teach you." I thought, oh gosh, you are Dewey. You are Dewey. So yes, I think I relate to Tilda very much. And even though I don't have a big lap dog, we definitely have a lap dog. And she's almost too big, but she can still be a lap dog.
The story, in many ways, seems to me to be a journey of self-discovery for Daniel, and of course, well, you mentioned before that your editor could see very clearly that this book could be and should be maybe about Daniel. And it is, in many ways, a journey of self-discovery for him, but also, in some ways, for Tilda herself. Don't you think? In what ways do these two characters influence each other?
Well, I think at first she sees him as a pest, and yet then it opens her up to her own childhood. Mm-hmm. She's reminded of her own childhood when she was abandoned at her aunt's house by her parents, when she was new to While Away Lane. And so even though that's never discussed with Daniel, her sensitivity toward him changes. She becomes much more sensitive, and because she's empathetic to him. And so I think that has something to do with it. And she definitely cares about him because she really wanted to put the hosta, mm-hmm. In that, garden show in competition. And yet when she finds out that he's in a play, she doesn't want to miss it. That doesn't even seem important to her anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what happens when people we care about are in our lives. We know that, something we sometimes have to put aside because we know this other thing is more important to them.
Absolutely, and also, this kid that wanders into her life, in many ways represents a certain change in her view of life and of things around her, because she has won that contest so many times before that seems unimportant when it comes to this new friendship that she has found with this kid, and this new interest that she has in this kid's life and development.
Yes.
Now, there's another character here, which is Agatha Brown, and I find her extremely interesting as a character as well, even though she only appears here and there. She comes into the story at the beginning, and then some other characters talk about her, and we hear about certain things having to do with her past and also with her present. And it's a character that is seen in a way in which she perhaps is not. She is a character that I always, as I was reading the book, I found myself wanting to know more about. I wonder if it's a character that maybe could become the protagonist of a book of her own. But what I find interesting about her is her story of wanting to do one thing and not being able to do that thing because of the pressure of her parents. How did this character come about?
Well, I always like to have characters in a book, or at least one character, where we think they're one way and they're really another. You stated that a little bit ago, that, she seemed different until then you get to know who she really is. And so I knew there was a piano teacher. I know that a lot of kids had to take piano, or, I've known grown-ups that said, oh, I had to take piano lessons, I had to practice. And I always think, boy, that must be heavy duty being a piano teacher. You're just not liked as much unless the kid is like somebody that just absolutely, is Ray Charles and wants to, wants to play the piano. But so that was where the fact that we see her in that stereotype, strict, person. But I love having someone that we see her one way and then she's really another way. I've done that in other books.
Mm-hmm.
And when Zachary Beaver came to town, and I know I'm mentioning a book you haven't read yet, but there's an older lady that is the town librarian, and the boys that, the boy that's the main character is Toby, his best friend's Cal, and they see her one way, that she's this older lady. And I think the readers, that doesn't have much of a life, and they just think of her as an older lady in the town. But she's really got, one, she's a very accepting person, and they also, the boys discover that she had this great romance at one time, and that it didn't work out. But then they never can see her quite the same way after that, because that's not how they saw Miss Murray May Pruitt. And so that was in that book. And I think that's what I love doing that, because people think people a certain way, and they may be different. And when Zachary Beaver came to town, it's about a sideshow boy that the fattest boy in the world, he's billed as the fattest boy in the world as a sideshow, is abandoned in this little Texas town. I have him as a neat freak in his trailer that he lives in. Mm-hmm. And I have had children say, why did you make Zachary neat? And I said, well, can I ask you a question? Why did you think he wouldn't be neat? Mm-hmm. And they kind of look embarrassed. They kind of cave into themselves. And I said, because of his way he looks, right? And they'll kind of shyly nod. And I'll say, and that's why I wanted him to be different. I wanted him to be different, because just because someone looks like they wouldn't care about their house, he did, where he lived. And so that's just important to me to do that in my books. It's fun. It's fun because there's an element of surprise you hope the reader gets, and that's what I hope you got when you were reading it. Oh, she's not quite like mm-hmm. There's something a little more there, and she had a little past. And I also, the thing with Agatha, I think because the book does have an underlying storyline about gifts, mm-hmm. finding your gift, using your gift, like Tilda questions if she'd wasted hers. I think that many of us are afraid of our gifts, and so I think she represents that.
You're listening to the voice of Kimberly Willis Holt, and this is a new episode of The Written Page, which you'll be able to hear on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, very soon. And my name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson, Tennessee. And we're talking about Kimberly's latest book, just really hot off the presses, The Lost Boy's Gift. Came out a few weeks ago, and in the title itself, The Lost Boy's Gift, we have that idea of gift that you were talking about, but we also have this intertextual allusion to Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie's great novel. It figures in the title, it also figures in the story. Why is it that you are establishing this connection between Peter Pan and this novel, The Lost Boy's Gift?
Well, that sort of developed slowly. I think that there are all kinds of readers. And, in Dear Hank Williams, take P, L, or B, well, no, excuse me, I'm thinking of another book, excuse me, in Piper Reed.
Mm-hmm.
She is not a reader, she's dyslexic. And this Piper Reed, for your listeners, is a character that I wrote 6 books about.
Mm-hmm.
She's dyslexic. She doesn't love reading. Her older sister does, her younger sister does. But then she discovers a dog book, and that becomes her book. And I think there are readers out there that they identify with one book, and that may be the book for them for a while. Just like Little Women was for me. I would reread it. My dad would get frustrated watching me reread that book. He'd go, there's more books than that book. But I needed that book at one time. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I kind of think that that's where he's at. That he likes being outside and having fun and, out there. And he doesn't look at reading as fun, except for that book. And he likes the action scenes in that book. And so that's really where that came from. I didn't know it was going to actually be developed like it did. And while I was writing, that just sort of happened organically.
What happens with Agatha Brown in many ways happens also with Daniel's mom. We see her through his eyes in one way because, of course, in part of the book we have the perspective of Daniel, so some of the story is told through his eyes by the narrator, and but then we find out that she is not the way that he thinks that she is, and she has her preoccupations, she has her troubles, her problems, but she also has her way of noticing things about her son that he doesn't really think that she can notice.
Right.
And on this note, I'm going back to this idea of, we are presented with reality in one way, but then reality is not the way that we think it is. And I think this is sort of like a recurrent theme in at least these 2 novels of yours that I have read.
That's true. I try to make adults real in the book too, or because kids think adults are one way. We did growing up. And I can remember when you start to learn about your parents and realize they were real people, that they have flaws, or that they were children. And so that, I think, is interesting in a children's book. It's funny, years ago, I took a class and the teacher said, if you want to write for children, or that she had heard from a children's author, if you want to write for children, keep the adults out of the book. And I think I've thought about that a lot, because I think what she means is you don't let the adults take over the story. Mm-hmm. And I agree there, definitely. But at that time, I thought she meant don't have any adults in the story. All of my books have adults in stories because adults were part of my life. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting when you do start to find out real about the people. When you start to find out, oh my goodness, there's that they were, handsome at one time, and they had a lot of women that liked them, or girlfriends, and they're seeing them as an old man, or I'm thinking of another book. Keeper of the Night, just there. I love that element of surprise because I think it happens to all of us if we keep our minds open to the possibilities that sometimes people seem one way, and then we find out a lot more about them, and it makes us more empathetic or more sympathetic, and that's not a bad thing.
No, absolutely not. And, the idea of gift also has a little bit to do with that. And I would like to turn to, I believe it's the last chapter in the book, to read just a short quote here that you have. The narrator says, if you listen closely, you might hear the song of chickadees returning in spring, a saxophone tune drifting from a neighbor's window, or even a teeny tiny snail nibbling on a lettuce leaf. The art of noticing is the gift we all own. And I think that really sums up a lot of what this book is about. Could you elaborate a little bit on this interesting idea that the art of noticing is the gift we all own?
Yes, and it's a gift that doesn't get practiced a lot anymore, I don't think. And, I'm not the first person to say this by any means, but our technology, we're turning into idiots in some ways. We're learning things from technology, but we're also becoming insensitive. We're not noticing the things around us. I walked into a coffee shop not too long ago, and everyone was on a device. And I've done that myself. I'm not trying to sound like I don't, have a phone that I don't look at. And I started looking around at everything, because everybody's heads were down. And I was like, I own all of this. What I meant by that was I'm getting to see all of this and they're missing out. And that's sad. I see that all the time when I go to eat. My husband and I were eating lunch yesterday, and, a father was on his phone looking at things. His little 4-year-old was, across from him. He's missing out, and he's going to know that one day. And so it's not to be preachy at all, but it is a concern of mine that we're going to miss out on the things that are really important. And because we're so busy looking at what, our devices show us, or, what's becoming so popular, trying to build a life. My husband and I were talking about this last night too. These online personas or lives that maybe really aren't real. And I don't know, it's just crazy. It's just a crazy time in our life right now. I mean, in the world right now because of that.
It definitely makes our lives more complex, more complicated, and it brings about the paradox of a technology that supposedly it's built for communication, actually becoming a hurdle for interpersonal communication.
It's true. It's true. I think it's harder now to communicate. I resent, in fact, when I write, that I have to address it. I have to address it. If I'm writing a contemporary book, I have to address it. And I kind of resent it because I want to be like I was in 1998 writing about, things that I didn't have to worry about email or texting and all of that in my work. And because of that, I feel like it gave books a chance to be classics. And what I mean by that, that they'll be pertinent years from now. Mm-hmm. But if you have something, we've all done that. We've read a book, and all of a sudden we go, "Oh, when was this book written?" Because something will pop up that is like a sore thumb. That technology that's changed, and you might not have even been thinking about the time period, but all of a sudden you are, and all of a sudden that something in the story seems outdated. I mean, that's one of the problems I think with our fast changing technology is it's a struggle as a writer on, how do you take this thing that is very prominent, is used in our lives where you can't ignore it. We all turn to it every day in some way. How do you put it in a book and it not be outdated by the time the book's even published, or a few years down the road?
Yeah, the technology changes so fast that the technology itself becomes obsolete very quickly as well. Now, it's a good thing, though, that the technology is there, because that way we can record this conversation, which would not be possible
if we didn't. There are wonderful things about technology, too. I'm not trying to say, that all of it's bad. I'm just saying the reality of it is it's a struggle as a writer if you're writing something contemporary or something you want to feel like is timeless. And I said classic a minute ago, and I really meant the word timeless, where somebody can read a story and it could have happened in any time period. Now the technology can hang you up.
Now the technology, that kind of technology at least, was not a problem in the time in which the other book of yours that I have read is set, Dear Hank Williams, which was released in 2015, about 4 years ago. And this is the first novel of yours that I ever found at the local library in Martin, Tennessee, where I used to live and where I still work, where I teach at the university over there. It was at the local library, and I saw the cover of it, and I saw the name of Hank Williams, and being interested in country music, then I quickly became interested in this novel. Because of Hank Williams, but also because of the fact that it's an epistolary novel. I've always liked that kind of fiction. I would like to speak briefly about this novel before winding down the conversation, and I would begin by asking you, how did this novel, Dear Hank Williams, come about? Because as we were talking about before we started recording the conversation, most of your audience, that age group, would not be aware of who Hank Williams Sr. was.
Right. Well, I was looking at reading the Texas Monthly magazine years ago, and there was an article in the magazine about the Gory Girls. And the Gory Girls were a singing group of women who were also prisoners. And they became local celebrities. They were on the radio, so they were broadcast around the state. And they would sing at rodeos. But that was fascinating to me, and this article was talking, about how these women got in prison. Some of them just drove the getaway car for their husbands, and I should say that this was in the late 1930s and the 40s, and I think they even had it go. The Gory Girls were until the 50s. Gory was the name of the warden at the prison, and so that. So the Gory Girls changed as they got in and out of prison. They would, somebody else would be in the band. Would take a place of somebody that was leaving prison. And some of them even got out early because people would write on their behalf because they were like, oh my goodness, somebody who sings like that, they couldn't, they've surely learned their lesson or whatever. And it was fascinating by the article. I thought, I'm going to do something with this. And I actually wrote something shortly after reading it, and I had to tuck it away because I was working on another book. So that's where it started. It started with a fascination with the singing group. And I thought, well, I'll write about a child whose mother is a Gory Girl. So that's really where it started. I had writer's block for a year and a half, and this book was very, very late. And I went to Louisiana and to my grandfather's home. He was still living. He was living in the Louisiana Veterans Home at the time. And I asked him if I could stay there and write. And he said yes. And so I did. And the first day I was there, I became, I realized, I was meant to be a writer. I just kept thinking of memories of my grandparents and how they told stories to me about their lives. And it really made it easy for me to start writing again just by going there. So that was a gift I feel like he gave me by letting me do that. But anyway, I set the story there in Louisiana. On the way there, I stopped in Shreveport, and I did some research there because I had been thinking about how the Louisiana Hayride, which was a radio show back then, that broadcast all over, the South for sure, that would be a part of the story. And of course, Hank Williams was, during the same time period that I was going to write about. So that's how it all came to be. Is that it just sort of organically happened gradually, but it was on that trip to Louisiana to go to write the story that I thought about using Hank Williams.
As you say, the novel is set in around 1948, 1949. That was around the time when Hank Williams Sr. was starting to get some regional attention on that Louisiana Hayride radio show that you mentioned that was broadcast on station KWKH. And that was a clear channel station back then. That's the technology that they had back then. In the same way that we have a certain kind of technology now, the radio was the big technology back in the 30s and 40s. And around that time, the hayride, at some points on some Saturday nights, would be heard all over America, not just in Louisiana. and it was a rival to the Grand Ole Opry out of WSM in Nashville, Tennessee. And at the Shreveport Municipal Auditorium, which is where the show originated and where it was broadcast from, some of the greatest artists in country music, not just Hank Williams, but Webb Pierce and even Elvis Presley, and so many of the greatest stars of country music began on the Louisiana Hayride. There are still some recordings, in fact, of some of these shows that can be heard and enjoyed. Did you have to do a lot of research about the time period? What were your worries as you were writing this story that was interesting to you, but that may seem kind of far away and sort of unknown to the kind of audience you were writing for?
I did. I listened to Hank Williams music. I bought actually some audio recordings of not just Hank Williams music at that time period, but also some that were I had a Louisiana Hayride audio that CD that I found, and listened to that too, just to get a feel of what Tate P. Ellerby would be listening to. And so that was really interesting to me, because the Hank Williams songs that I love were not part of that time period. So those seem to come later. But that was interesting to me to discover that and different music. And also I'd go to the local library that was the city that's closest to that little town that I was staying in, and I would research. And I would research at the Peace Parish Library and reading the newspapers from that time period. And I would write down headlines and stories that were important at that time. And even the ads make it realistic, because you start to see what did but radios cost. And, that way I knew what Uncle Jolly was going to get. And, those sort of things that are really interesting, like what milk cost. But also the circus coming to town, and all of those things. And also Hank Williams, he sang. There was a high school in Rapides Parish called Bolton High School, and a lot of famous singers at that time went to that high school, because probably that was where the biggest auditorium would be for them. But the other thing that I learned was that Hank Williams he became famous while he was there. He wasn't famous when he first got there. He had a small fame, but he really became famous while he was there, because he had a hit song, and that changed his life. And that's why, and that also gave me a wonderful way to sort of where to end the story, to kind of make his life parallel, or his storyline run along with Tate. So that was one way of doing it.
Yes, he came from rural Alabama, and he had moving on over, Lovesick Blues, which was originally an older song from the 1920s by a singer called Emmett Miller, who was a vaudevillian. But in any case, his appearance on the Louisiana Hayride basically made his career, and was a good starting point to become a member of the much bigger and much more popular Grand Ole Opry out of Nashville later on. Did you have any sort of inspiration from your family, because when you wrote this book, because they actually do come from central Louisiana?
Do you mean any of the characters in the story, or? Yeah,
the characters in the story, the setting of the story. It probably touched close to home in many ways.
Is Forest Hill, even though I changed the name to Rippling Creek. That is I've used that setting many times, because that was like home to me. That was the one place we always returned to visit my grandparents and visit my cousins and aunts and uncles, and that has always been a place of my heart. And so I have used it in several books, and I just changed the name of the town. So the setting is always important to me, and so the setting definitely was from that. And then being in my grandfather's house, well, that ended up being Tate's house because of that.
beyond
There wasn't a. I'm sorry.
beyond the fact that you had to do quite a bit of research about the time period and about the music and about Hank's career. This novel is written in the form of letters to Hank Williams. They're never really responded by Hank, but as you were writing the novel in this way, in the form of letters, this is a really interesting epistolary novel from the point of view of a kid. Did you encounter any difficulties in writing this kind of novel in the form of letters?
Yes, there were challenges because you wanted it to seem real or interesting to the reader. I did end up using dialogue. I struggled with that a little bit, going, well, do people do that? And I thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do that. She's telling a story. And some people would put, a really great letter writer might do that. And in a sense, it was her journal anyway, because even though she doesn't hear back from him, she feels like he's reading those stories. Her letters. And so in a way, he's the best of friends because he's keeping the thing in her heart, by secret. So I struggled with that. I also struggled a little bit, not too much, with the fact that he never writes her back. But I knew he never was going to write her back. I have a problem, and it's a very popular genre right now, where people have fictionalized real people's lives. And I didn't want to have Hank Williams, like one of my friends as she read it said, oh my goodness, thank goodness, I thought you were going to have him showing up with his on the porch. And she was so relieved that I didn't. And at the same time, it disappointed some people because I didn't. But he didn't do that. She's a made-up person, and I didn't want to say that he did something that he didn't do. I didn't have a problem with her receiving the pictures because I think that sort of thing would have happened where he wouldn't have even known about it, and would have sent the pictures to her. But I'll tell you something strange that I don't know if you saw the Hank Williams movie. I Saw the Light, I believe was the name of it. There's a line in there, and this came out after my book came out, but there is a line in there that he says, people write to me and tell me their problems, and I don't know how to write them back. I don't know what to say to them. And I thought, oh my goodness, it gave me goosebumps. Because that's the guy playing Hank Williams says that. And I thought, that was just so strange. My book had been out probably a year when I saw that movie.
And it makes the novel more realistic that he doesn't appear because I suppose Hank Williams at that point was getting so much fan mail to the radio station and probably to his own house because he was, just like any country star at that time, very close to the audience. Their private lives were not kept a secret the way that a lot of private lives of stars are kept a secret these days. And so it would be very likely that a secretary or somebody would in the publicity department would send Tate or somebody like Tate at the time an autographed picture of Hank, whether Hank autographed it or not. Reading your novel, in fact, I remember thinking that as a kid, I read a similar novel entitled Dear Bruce Springsteen by Canadian author Kevin Major, in which a kid, in this case a boy, writes to Bruce Springsteen, who is his idol, talking about a book from probably the late 80s or so. And of course, Bruce Springsteen never writes back, but it's sort of the same idea that through the letters we get to know a lot more about the character, about her life, about her dreams, about things that worry her and that are important to her. We get to know more about her family. And one thing, and I would like to make this sort of a last question about Dear Hank Williams. Tate seems to create a world of her own through writing to compensate for the reality that she dislikes, because she has a very complicated family dynamics going on in her lives. In her life, this idea of creating a world to compensate for certain things in reality that a character dislikes seems to be, again, a recurrent element in your work, wouldn't you say?
I guess it does. I mean, you're very perceptive, and I guess it does. Yeah.
Just to finish our conversation, which really has been a pleasure, Kimberly, and I appreciate your patience through a little glitch that we had in communication at some point during the conversation, which hopefully will not be apparent on the final product, on the final video, the final podcast episode. I would like to ask you, from your point of view, let's say somebody's listening to our conversation out there and they would like to write for young adults or for kids, or they just want to become a writer in general. What do you think that one needs to have or one needs to do in order to become a writer? And I ask you because that idea of noticing, the gift of noticing, I think it's very important when it comes to being a good or a perceptive writer. But what do you think one needs to have or one needs to do in order to become a writer?
I think discipline it's something I still struggle with. In the beginning, I didn't struggle with it as much. Once I found the story I was meant to write on my first book, My Louisiana Sky. But you have to be able to sit down and be in a room by yourself or among strangers, because if you're with a friend, you're going to talk. Let's face it. And be able to write and put words on a page, and also not expect perfection on a first draft. Know that it's part of the process is rewriting. And so if you can just be fearless, sit down at the same place if you can, have a place that you go to, put your heart on the page, even if it seems rough and you know it's not publishable at that point, just write. And it will be better, because you're going to rewrite it so that it can be read by other people and enjoyed by other people. But I think it boils down to, I think what keeps talented people from writing and being writers, because I'm telling you, I know that there are people out there that have a lot of writing talent that don't do it, and the one reason why is the discipline. I was in writing classes early on. I took every writing class I could, that was taught at the college for continuing ed, and I was the least talented person, but I wanted it more, and I showed up every day to write.
Kimberly Willis Holt, the award-winning author of this book I have in my hand right now, The Lost Boy's Gift. She's written other fine books for young adults, like Dear Hank Williams. We talked about that one as well. The Water Seeker, My Louisiana Sky, When Zachary Beaver Came to Town, and also the Piper Reed chapter book series, of which she has written 6 installments so far. Before we say goodbye, I would like to ask you, Kimberly, do you have any future projects that you're working on that you can tell us about?
Yes, I'm currently working on a companion novel for my most popular book, When Zachary Beaver Came to Town. I'm writing a book that's about Toby's. Toby was the main character when Zachary Beaver came to town. I'm writing about his daughter.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to that, and hopefully we can talk about that one when it comes out here on The Written Page. It has definitely been a pleasure, despite all the glitches that we've had with communication. It really has been a pleasure to have you here on The Written Page, and I really would recommend wholeheartedly any book by Kimberly Willis Holt, and particularly this one that just came out just a few weeks ago, The Lost Boy's Gift, published by Henry Holt and Company out of New York. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for answering our call and guesting today on The Written Page.
Very much. Yeah.
This has been a new episode of The Written Page that you will be able to listen to on the YouTube channel Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. Mine is the copyright of this podcast. The year is 2019, and it has been recorded live in Jackson, in the state of Tennessee, in the United States of America. Our guest has been Kimberly Willis Holt, and her latest book is The Lost Boy's Gift. Thank you for your attention, and so long, everybody.